Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be testing the Ruger ARX 9mm Luger Plus B self-defense load. So let's take a closer look at the cartridge. Now what first jumps out at you is this very unique projectile. As you can tell, this isn't your standard JHP or hollow point that we're used to testing. It's got kind of a spiral design to it, and we'll explain why it has that later. You can also tell it's got an off-colored projectile, and the reason for that is because it's actually constructed of a copper and plastic mix, copper and polymer. Now what we're used to seeing is a lead core and a copper jacket, but by utilizing this mixture of substances, what we get is a very lightweight bullet. As you can tell, we're dealing with an 80 grain projectile, which allows it to travel at 1,445 feet per second. Now the reason why Ruger designed it this way is because they're trying to get what they call, I don't want to misquote them so I'll turn it, maximum hydraulic displacement and terminal energy transfer to targets. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about some common misconceptions with those terms, specifically when dealing with handgun ammunition, but I'll save you guys from my opinion and how I think this ammunition is going to perform, and let's just get out and test it. So let's take a look at the results. The projectile struck the left side of the block. I was worried it was going to pop out the side, but this one did not. We have a 0.4 inch permanent cavity that reaches from the 0 inch mark out to 9 inches. From there, we can tell that the projectile is actually stable because of the spiraling pattern throughout the ballistics gelatin. Now, after 9 inches, we run into a bit of a problem. We see a tapering down of that permanent cavity, which indicates that the projectile actually spun in some other sort of direction. As we can tell out here at rest at the 15 inch mark, we have the projectile. It seems to be facing backwards, but the permanent cavity continues on to 15.5 inches. Now you might see that in some ballistic gelatin tests, especially with people that use the organic matter. And what that means basically is that projectile was able to reach out to that distance, do damage, but the elasticity of the gel brought it back. So on slow motion, you would see it rock back and forth and then come to its final resting place. So I'm going to flip the block over and we'll give you a look at that second shot. Okay, so we're following these two paths here for our final two shots out of the Smith and Wesson Shield. The first one came in, we see a 1/4 inch permanent cavity out to the 3 inch mark. From there, it seems that the projectile started to yaw quite a bit. We have a 1/2 inch permanent cavity that runs from that 3 inch mark out to 5.5 inches. From there, the projectile yaws again out to 7.5 inches. We see a 1/2 inch permanent cavity again. And from there, it seems that the projectile was completely backwards running through the gel. We have a little hook here that runs from 7.5 inches all the way out to 11 inches, where the projectile came out of the bottom of the block and embedded itself in the table. Now just below that is our second shot. This one performed slightly better. We have that 0.4 inch permanent cavity that we had from the Beretta, very similar. This one reached all the way out here until about 8 inches, which is pretty good. After that, we can see it starts to destabilize and yaw a little bit, just like all the other projectiles. We see that after 8.5 inches, the permanent cavity kind of dwindles down to about 1/4 of an inch, and then once again in this area somewhere the projectile went completely backwards and penetrated all the way out 16 inches this time, which is pretty good. It struck that second block of gel and we found it at rest in between the two blocks of gel. Alright guys, so here's that projectile that we saw in the ballistics gelatin. It's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to take a moment here to talk about something that we've run into literally every time we've tested a low mass, high velocity handgun cartridge. There are always naysayers out there that tell us like, oh, but the kinetic energy transfer would have significant knockdown power and all of this trash. Now, if you look at the side of the box of these guys and all these other low mass, high velocity handgun cartridges, you're going to see some very bold claims about revolutionizing personal defense, and you're going to see a bunch of pseudoscientific terms that are used as marketing schemes to try to get you guys to buy this shit. Now look, I'm just going to lay it out straight. Out of all the research I've seen, and out of our 3 years of testing, what we've found is that handgun cartridges do not propel their projectile fast enough in order to impart enough kinetic energy to permanently tear human tissue. Now, what does that all mean? Basically, if you're firing a handgun, that bullet has to come into literal contact with whatever you want it to destroy. We're not going to see any sort of permanent cavitation around the area where the bullet was that it didn't physically touch. Now, to prove that, take a look at our tests. our G2 RIP test, our Liberty Civil Defense test, even this test here. Take a look at the slow-mo and look at how large that temporary cavity is. We have a large energy dump right in the beginning, right? It looks spectacular, a nice large temporary cavity, but then it collapses back down and we have these super weak, very small in diameter permanent cavities, and that's purely due to the lack of energy transfer. We get full energy transfer from this projectile, don't get me wrong, but it's just not enough energy because there's not enough velocity. Now, if you want to see some permanent cavitation done directly from kinetic energy, take a look at our test from that Nosler Trophy Grade 308. Now, this is a 165 grain projectile traveling at 2,800 feet per second. Now, that is really fast. It's literally double the testing ammo we had today. Now, anything over 2,000 feet per second should do some damage using just purely kinetic energy. So we're not even close to that with this ammunition, and this is very fast for 9mm. But getting back to that Nosler Trophy Grade, it literally cracked the table in half. On the outside of the ballistics gelatin block, we had permanent damage in an area where the projectile came nowhere near. So we know it's strictly from permanent cavitation. We had, I believe it was a 3-inch diameter circle of just purely devastated tissue on that ballistics gelatin block. So basically what we're saying is if you see something on the market that's a handgun cartridge, that's low mass, high velocity, marketed for self-defense, just stay away from it. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this crazy rant. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.